Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Beckham. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm sure you know the drill by now. As photographers, there's always going to be those times when we grab a shot and later when we look at it on the computer, we regret what we've done. We then give ourselves a little lecture on what we should have done right, that we should have taken more care. These things happen. The author who took this picture made a rather hasty decision. They took a quick shot rather than thinking more about what they were doing, and that was a mistake. I know there was a tripod available and it wasn't used, so the 400 ISO was not really required. 100 ISO was available with the tripod, or if you could steady the camera on a solid surface. Now this means the author introduced noise when they really didn't need to. They also took their eye off the ball with regard to exposure, and the important part of the scene, the bottom half, is underexposed. The brighter sky has fooled the camera and the photographer into thinking it needed less light. It didn't. So here we have a noisy image where we need to lift the shadow tones, and that's likely to just make the noise issues far worse. The sky could have done with less exposure, but if we had used 100 ISO, then our editing latitude with regard to noise would be much better, and maybe we could address the bright sky more easily. So when we're looking through our images as thumbnails, do we put something like this down to experience and just move on? No. Let's own the mistakes and make out it was all part of the creative plan to start with. Let's open this up in Camera Raw. The place I usually go to first whenever I open an image into Adobe Camera Raw is the optics. But because this image was shot with a Sony RX10, the chromatic aberration and lens corrections are already built in. So I'm going to go straight to my basic tab because I think what we're going to need here is mainly exposure, clarity and colour. So let's squeeze just a little bit of exposure, and I'm watching mostly the bottom part of the image here, not the sky at the moment. You can see the histogram moving to the right, so I'm going to increase the highlights, the whites just a little bit, maybe a little touch of blacks, but mainly clarity and colour. And I think I'll just lift that just a touch more, maybe not as much as that. That's the sort of thing I'm thinking of at the moment. If you look down at the bottom left corner though, you'll see that we've got quite a lean on the buildings here, and that's caused by the wide-angle lens that was used. What I'd like to do is see if I can correct that. To do that, I'm going to scroll down to the geometry section, open it up, and I'm going to click and drag on the vertical slider. Now, as I do that, you'll notice that Photoshop starts to correct the problem and also gives us a grid as a guide. So I need to decide just how much I'm going to move this. I'm just looking at those poles in the water. I think something like that is going to be pretty straight, and as soon as we release any pressure or the mouse from the vertical slider, then the grid disappears. Now we've got a couple of choices here. We can crop the image because we can clearly see that's a need now, but we do get the opportunity in this section to scale the image, and I think I'll choose that. You can see as I move to the right, I can just fill in the edges, and as long as I'm not doing any damage to the pictorial value of the image, then it's not looking too bad. Now, given the changes that I've just made, I suppose it wouldn't be a bad idea to go to the crop tool just to make sure we don't wish to make a crop. Now, I'm not going to get my rule of thirds line right along that distant edge there, but it's along the tree line, which is pretty good. But I think I can come down just a little bit and we get a little more of a panoramic shape, which I think we can work with. I'll hit the Enter key and Control 0 to fit the image on screen, but now we need to address that sky. And I think we need to do that first up with a graduated filter. So let's select it from the toolbox on the right. I'll start somewhat down the middle there, or let's say about a third down, and drag down the selection because I don't want to affect the middle distance too much, but I do want to affect the top quite a lot. So let's turn to the controls on the right and see what we can do with that graduated filter. Now the main problem here is highlights and whites, but probably highlights and exposure, I guess. If I drop the highlights down, we're having some effect, but I think we need to drop the exposure quite a bit too. Something like that should do it. I think there's an argument here whether we want to just take the temperature down a little bit. This is a sort of a wintry scene, so a little bit of hint of blue up there is not going to be too bad. It does match the water. I think I'll go down and try a bit of clarity and also a little bit of dehaze. And now we're beginning to see quite a bit of the sky come into play. I think I'd like the top to be slightly darker, but not very much. So I'm just going to add a second graduated filter just down there, but I don't want it as dense as that. It's picking up all of the changes from the previous. So if we go within the bounding box here, or the selection, right click, we can reset that. I'll just touch my V key to hide those for a moment, because all I want to do is to just bring that top down just a touch. And there it's not looking too bad at all. But because we've had to lean quite heavily on the sliders, and because we've been dealing with an underexposure problem and high ISO, we've got quite a problem here with noise. So let me touch my Z key to bring my zoom back, and we'll zoom in. There you see it. Probably not as bad as we may expect, but I'd like to do something about that. So I'm going to go to my detail section, and I'm going to put quite a bit of noise in here. Normally I put a noise reduction of about 25 to 30, but I think given what my intentions are with this image once I get it open into Photoshop, I'm going to push that even higher. I could come back and change this later because we're going to open this image up as a smart object. Let me right click and fit the image into the view, because what I want to do just for a couple of seconds is just take a look at the picture before I leave Adobe Camera Raw. Do I want to do any other work? Well, maybe I could just lift those clouds lying against the hillside there just a touch, just to increase the contrast a little bit. So I'm going to pick up my adjustment brush. This is the area I want to work on, so I'm just painting down there. No changes as yet, but the pin is in place. I just want a little more exposure here. You can see the flow rate I've got set for this tool now is very low. So I just want to sweep down here. You can see the tones lifting. I don't want to go too far, but just a little. Maybe a little bit on the right hand side, but I think that's all I care to do. Maybe a little bit down there. No, I don't like that. Control Z will undo that. So I've reached a point, I think, where I'm more or less willing to open this up into Photoshop. So I'm going to go down to the bottom and open this up as a smart object. I'm sure you know how to turn on smart object status. Go to the hyperlink at the bottom of the screen, click that, and you cannot miss the setting. So let's open this up into Photoshop. Now we could carry on working with this image just as it is, and you can see the little symbol that's telling us it's a smart object, which means we can just double click the thumbnail and be back into Camera Raw to make adjustments anytime we please. But I want to try running one of the Nik filters on here. I used this filter a few days ago in a previous video and it worked very well. So I want to have a look here. I'm going to go to my filters menu, my Nik collection and the Color Effects Pro 4. Now as it's appeared on screen, I think it's already picking up the selection that I last used, but just to make sure, I'll scroll down and this is the one that I'm looking for. It's called Tonal Contrast, and as I select it, there's no difference to the image, so it must have been selected. But I can compare it to the original by going to the top left and just click and hold on the compare button and release. Hold and release. You can see there is a difference there that I think is worth having. I suppose the downside is we may be introducing a little more noise, but I'm going to click OK to open this back up into Photoshop. Now as the image opens up, I do have quite a degree of flexibility here with a smart object and a smart filter. I can double click the words down here, open this back up into our filter system and make an adjustment to the filter I've just applied should I need to. I can select the mask and mask away the filter effect in any strategic locations that I need to. And here I've got a smart object which enables me to double click and go straight back into Camera Raw. Now I don't think I need any of those, but isn't this a good place to save this as a Photoshop file so we store what we've got done so far? So I'm going to touch the Control and the spacebar key here. I'll right click and select 100% and holding the spacebar I'm just going to move around the image and just have a look at the noise. It's certainly got noise visible in the picture, but given what we've done here, it's not as bad as we may expect. So I'm going to hit Control 0. If you wanted to see if you could even get rid of more of that noise, you do have the opportunity to double click the smart object and have a look at the noise options in Photoshop. I don't think I'd want to go any further than I have here. So what I'm going to do here is to flatten these to move forward. If I go to the top right here, I'll go down and flatten, because what I want to do next is to remove that branch coming in at the top left. I don't think it's adding anything to our image. I think if we saw a bit of upright on the left, I may leave it there. But as it is, it's just looking a little bit odd. So I think I'll try Content Aware Fill, and I think given the location, that should work pretty well. So I'll select one of the selection tools. It really doesn't matter which one, whichever one you like best. I've always been a fan of the polygonal lasso. Even though it only makes straight lines, it works for me a lot of the time. Once I've got the selection made, I'm going to go into Edit and Content Aware Fill. The left-hand side is where the repair is coming from. We're looking over on the right to see the effect of the repair when Photoshop gets around to doing it. Now it's made the repair. I can just see a little hint there. Not a big deal, nothing I couldn't deal with the clone or the spot healing brush. But if I go up to the top of the screen here, hit the minus and just remove some of this, maybe I can improve matters, but we have to wait a few seconds. You can see a little spinning row of circles down at the bottom right corner of that second window. Still got a bit of a smear there. I'm going to pick up my zoom and I think I'll zoom out a little bit just so I can see exactly where it's taking all of that from. Maybe we're picking up some darker tones along the top. Let me try removing some of those and see if that makes a slightly better job. If it doesn't, then after a couple of tries like this, then I would open it up and I would deal with that little section in the top left with probably something like the clone tool. So I'm going to select current layer and OK. And we'll open this up into Photoshop. Control D will remove the selection. Control 0 will fit the image on screen. Just to make sure I don't make any silly mistakes here, although I've got plenty of undo history I can fall back on. But Control-Shift-N brings up the new layer dialog. Enter produces a nice blank layer sitting above the background. So I can do a little repair on there, and when I'm happy with it, I can merge these two together or flatten them together. And here's a technique I've used for years and years, and it always works. So let me demonstrate it and hope it doesn't let me down now I've built it up quite highly. I'm going to drop my flow rate down to about 30 or 40%. I'll take it to 30. Holding the Alt key, I'm going to sample from this point, move over here and just touch a couple of times and dab down. And you can see, pretty seamless. If you didn't see me working at the top left, you would never know we'd been around there. And if I turn off the image, that's all that's there, but it's doing the job. So let me go to the top right and we'll flatten again. Now what I'd like to do is touch out one or two distractions on the left hand side. I'm going to zoom in down here. I want to work around here. I'm going to pick up my spot healing brush. What we could have done is created another new blank layer, but I don't think I'm too concerned. I'm just going to paint over those white areas there. I want them to go. They're a little bit distracting right down on that bottom edge. That should do okay. But I've got one or two others. That looks like a flying bird, which certainly doesn't look like a bird. This square of white is really distracting, but when you do these things, don't forget the reflection in the water. There's a white mark there. A little mark there. Is that another flying bird or a bit of dirt on the sensor? A bit of blue there. A little bit there. You can see what I'm doing here. I'm trying to take away anything that's going to be distracting over here. And it's all very easy to do. Let's take that away and that away. And I also chose to take these silver tops, although I didn't take this one away. But I think that's just going to be a personal choice. Let me hit Control-0 and take a look around to make sure I'm happy with what I've done so far. Now I would like to darken the edges and the corners of the image, a slight vignette to keep our attention on the main aspect of the image. Normally I would pick up a selection tool, but let's do it in a slightly different way. I'm going to go to my layers on the right hand side. I just need to remove that lock for a moment because I'm going to go down and select my adjustment layers and I'll choose levels. And what I'm going to do here is move my mid-tone to the right. And you can see I've taken it quite a long way, because what I can do now with the mask is I can paint on the mask in black. So if I select black, the standard soft edge brush, I'll make my brush really large. You can see the flow rate up at the top middle is around 20%, but the opacity is 100%. Let's have a look and make sure that's not going to be too heavy a flow for what I want to do. But there you can see I can start to lighten this just in the center where I want. I think it is a bit heavy, so I'll drop it down to 10 and my brush down a little bit. So I want to bring up the tones around here, but leave them nice and dark around the edge. And that's looking quite nice. You can see the effect up here. Doesn't look very effective when we look at it in a tiny thumbnail, but it does a pretty good job. And we can tell that when we turn it on and off. So there's one other thing I'd like to do is to add a bit of colour in strategic locations. So it goes without saying that we should be saving this work regularly and often. But again, I'm happy to merge them or flatten the image. It doesn't matter which. I'm going to go to my toolbox, pick up my sponge tool. Make sure I've got it set to saturate and a flow of about 10%, because what I'd like to do is to just help keep the attention down in this middle distance with just a little more colour. A little more in the trees, but it's mainly the warm colours there. That's all I really wanted to do, just lift it slightly. Now here's an optional extra that I'd just like to try. I'm going to make a copy of my background layer with Ctrl J. I'm going to go up to my filters menu. I'm going to choose blur and Gaussian blur. I'm just going to add about 20 pixels in radius and OK. Because what I'm going to do with this layer is just drop it down. I'm going to use keyboard shortcuts here because I always find these very useful. If you touch the M key and then the number keys on the right hand side, if I touched the number 4 for example, I instantly get a 40% opacity, and if you look at the top right of the layers you can see that's applied. And it's convenient because you can try it at 40%. If you feel it needs to be greater, you can touch the 8 key and jump to 80%, or reduce it to 30%. You get the idea. But I did apply a softness to this, given that it was a little bit of a noisy image, but it's not turned out as bad as I thought. But I'm going to touch the 4 key and go back to the 40% opacity. But what we can also do with this soft focus, and again to help keep our eye in the important area of the picture, is to add a layer mask, pick up that black again, same soft edge brush that we've been using, drop the size. Let me just zoom in a little bit here. Looking up at the top of the screen once again, 100% opacity, 10% flow, that should be enough. But if we just want a little more detail in the trees just to come through here, we can just remove the softness there just to bring the attention right where we want it. We're all going to choose something different. And once we're happy with that, of course, we can merge or flatten them to finish. So now we can take a look at the image we began with and compare it to the images we created to see if we think that the effort was worth it. Now I've always stated that Photoshop shouldn't really be considered as software to fix problems that should have been dealt with at the taking stage. However, we're all human and we all make mistakes from time to time. And with a bit of creative thought and the tools of Photoshop, we can sometimes redeem the situation somewhat. We do know that our landscapes don't always have to be pin sharp. The Impressionist painters from hundreds of years ago taught us that. I'll see you next time.